the first calling laid upon every Christian is to be a hearer of the word. And there's no sin-free way to leave that calling behind. So you have pastor and hearer paired together. Then you have husbands and wives, parents and children. And those are all callings that God lays upon us, from which the only way we can depart is by means of sin. And I wonder if it's sort of self-defeating, if we've seen sort of the last waves of feminism as a result of our really finally buying into this egalitarian mentality, that now not only are men and women interchangeable, but now there is a fluidity between both, right? And so you see, the transgender movement is the thorn in the side, really, of like third wave feminism. If we take away choices from man, then he has to return home. He has to re-engage with his family. He has to do the hard work, but the meaningful work of, raising his children, catechizing them, overseeing their schoolwork, tucking them in at night, saying bedtime prayers with them. He has to do all those things.
Before we begin our episode today, we just want to take a quick moment to say thank you. We've had success that far surpassed our goals in this past year. And because of this, we are working on a new endeavor with Adam Kuntz and others, something we are just very excited about here. We are starting a Lutheran Institute of Theology, which will give you formalized courses in theological subjects ranging from church history to theological topics to how to read the Bible with some of the best minds in the Lutheran Church. Individuals like Adam Kuntz, Christian Preuss, other professors at our Concordias, and our seminaries. We're just extraordinarily excited to share this with you. So please check down in our description where you'll see a link to our new website that provides more information on what we're doing there for the Institute and how you can help support us. Again, thank you for your support, and now enjoy the episode.
So what do you think the difference is between kind of feminine strength and masculine strength? How would you define that?
Well,
are we live, by the way, Bennett? Yeah, okay.
So just as we were saying, it's complementary. So her strength does what his cannot, his does what hers cannot. And even the way that their bodies are shaped, and the way that they develop is very different one from another. So she has, narrower shoulders and broader hips. He has broader shoulders and narrower hips. And so her strength, the strength of her femininity, her womanhood, is very much internal to her body. So she has this capacity to bring new life into the world, which is, it's a superhero kind of strength. A man's body, he has broader shoulders, narrower hips, and that orients him outside of himself. So he's got broad shoulders for carrying a load. He's got, arms that can stretch out, hold things for the purpose of being protective. But it's not intrinsic to him in the same way. Masculinity is not. It sort of doesn't come naturally to him in the way that femininity comes naturally to a woman. So she naturally will have rites of passage that signify to her she's passing from girlhood into womanhood, right? So when she begins to menstruate, for instance, it's a signal, something physically changes in her body that says we've crossed one of those thresholds. When she gives birth, it's sort of crossing the final threshold that says this is what your body is designed to do, and now it has done that. And so there's no question in her mind then that she's a woman and not a girl. But a man doesn't have those natural rites of passage like that. So he depends on the community of other men to sort of initiate him into manhood, to give him the pat on the back, the attaboy, to bring him through some kind of trial to show him that he is passing from boyhood into manhood, and that's very much because masculinity is oriented outside of man. Right. So all the way back in the garden, when God says it's not good for man to be alone, masculinity can't exist on its own. Right. So the MGTOW bros are wrong. Men going their own way, rejecting the company of women, rejecting the company of other men. That's decidedly anti-masculine.
So it seems like as you go through, masculinity is more fragile in that it's very difficult for a woman not to understand her passage through life, but a man can stay in that childhood state because they don't have those aspects built in.
Yeah, certainly. And he's always sort of drawn back away from masculinity. So if masculinity is reducible to sacrifice, if that's the essence of it, and that orients man outside of himself, then he's always being drawn back to the perversity of his flesh. He's always being drawn back to selfishness, which is, in as much as selfishness is a distortion of masculinity, selfishness is effeminate. So it doesn't matter, and this is, Paul uses this word in 1 Corinthians 6. He's got a list of 10 sins that he says you used to be until you were washed, sanctified, justified. And one of those groups of sinners, malakoi, is a word that the philosophers before Paul, so Aristotle and then the peripatetic philosophers, are using to say it's not a physical softness, but it's a softness of character. So no matter how strong a man is, right? No matter what he looks like in the mirror at the gym, if he possesses an internal softness, a kind of selfishness, then he's not manly. He's not virtuous. So that's the virtue philosophers before Paul, and then Paul includes this word in 1 Corinthians 6 in a long list of other like big category commandment level kinds of sins. Now, modern translations will lump together malakoi and arsenokoitai, and then you get a footnote like at the bottom of the NIV or the ESV that says these two words together refer to the passive and the active participant in the homosexual act, and it'll translate the whole thing as those who practice homosexuality. Now, after Paul, those words will be used that way to describe those two participants in the homosexual act. Before Paul, I don't think there's any textual evidence of those words being used, being paired together in that way. So if we understand that malakoi, effeminate men or selfish men, in that way, it fits with all these other high-level, broad category sins: idolatry, adultery, theft, false witness, slander, that the only way to be saved from is to be washed, sanctified, justified, like he says in verse 11.
So is that meaning like that the life is oriented towards self, kind of focused on self-preservation, self-pleasure?
Yeah.
But it's that kind of focus is what we're looking at with that word?
Yeah. Right. So
like something like maybe masturbation would be an example, right?
Sure.
Where
yeah,
it's
certainly.
something to serve the self.
Yeah. So in the garden, you have Adam is intended to be oriented outside of himself, and then in the fall, you see the perversion of all of this, right? So when he begins to treat his wife as a kind of guinea pig in his science experiment, he becomes self-serving. In the moment of sin, when their eyes are downcast to themselves, he becomes self-centered, and then when God confronts him with his sin, what have you done? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? His reaction is to say, it's everyone else's fault but mine. So he's self-preserving then. So yeah, certainly, masturbation or, any rejection of seeing oneself as an instrument for the good of others, right? That's the temptation to which every man is drawn from that moment in the garden, when Adam sins by his passivity, and Eve sins by her activity. Man's temptation is much more towards that passive, selfish, self-indulgent kind of activity.
Bennett, can you look up on your phone, just so you can toss it to me? Can you type in, or Josh, either or, Paralandra, quote from Paralandra, which is Perelandra, where the genders are revealed. Okay, if you can find it, I think it applies really well here. Have you read Paralandra?
A long time ago.
Oh man, it's my master's thesis was on this.
Oh, nice.
So but the way that Lewis deals with gender and the poetic way that he goes about this is really, really cool. But another one that you're making me think of, and we were talking with Ben Ball about this, but I don't think it was on the recording last night. Lord of the Rings guy, are you?
Yeah.
So the movies, I thought they did a great job, right? The one character that I don't think they did well in the movies was Faramir. What's that? No, it should have the word like Melicandra and Paralandra. You might not be able to find it, but it's from the book Paralandra, C.S. Lewis. If you put that in, that might help. I can paraphrase it if we can't find it, but in the Lord of the Rings one, so you've got Boromir and Faramir, right? And Boromir, they do a good job in the movie. So he's a very like outwardly masculine man. Like he's very strong. He's a great warrior, very bold, in those aspects. But his temptation is he really wants the ring because he wants to like bolster up. He sees himself as like achieving great glory and the praise is coming to him. And, so he keeps becoming more and more self-focused. He wants to achieve this glory. And that's when he has his fall where he tries to take the ring from Frodo. But then there's this beautiful moment where he repents at the end to Aragorn, and Aragorn gives him absolution, right? So it's a beautiful aspect. So Tolkien's kind of drawing us into that narrative of looking at the masculine struggle within Boromir. But then in the second book, you get Faramir, who's his younger brother. And Faramir, very, very masculine, but he's kind of outside of maybe Aragorn, but Faramir is kind of the inverse of that, where you see the internal strength. He's a great warrior, but he's tempted with the ring. He finds the ring, and it's almost no temptation for him. And Frodo's, Sam blurts it out, and Frodo's like, "Oh no!" And Faramir, kind of plays him on a little bit. He's like, "Don't worry, this isn't a temptation for me." But then he uses the line. And he says, "I love the sword for its sharpness. I love the arrow for its swiftness. All right, no, I'm sorry. I don't love the sword for its sharpness. I don't love the arrow for its swiftness, and I don't love the warrior for his glory. But I love that which they defend." And it just goes to show like his orientation is about sacrificing himself. He's not worried about himself. He wants to defend that which is beautiful, which is that great masculine ideal of there's a home to defend. There's a beauty to defend.
Right. Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. Perfect example. And I mean, the nature of masculinity gives every man sort of the opportunity to be a hero like that, to be a warrior like that. But he has to be called outside of himself. And so none of us obviously does that well. The nature of sin still is always to be curved in on ourselves. But so being redeemed by the one good man himself, we also have in Jesus then an example for masculinity. I mean, what's more masculine than the cross? And there he undoes all of Adam's perversion. Right? He's not self-serving or self-centered or self-preserving in the least. And he's very right. His sacrifice on the cross doesn't come by accident. But it happens very intentionally, right? No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. And so he will die, and he will give his life to redeem the world, and to ransom his bride for himself, but he will do it very much on his own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so, man has opportunity to do that as well. We don't always get to pick the way in which we are afflicted with crosses in this life.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't always get to choose the opportunities we have to serve. But when they come, man has the opportunity to be intentional about embracing those callings in that moment. Right. So, Paul speaks of husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in Ephesians 5. Most men will never have that sort of once and final sacrifice for the good of their wives. But every man, when he gets up, has opportunity to die to himself, to his own needs, his own desires, his own good, and to see himself as an instrument for the good of his bride, the good of his family. And there is a kind of manly intentionality to that. That he has to choose, how to parcel out his time, how to parcel out his strength. Because if he spends it all at once, then he's done.
Yeah.
But so vocation kind of lets him pick and choose more towards the center of the target, more towards the bullseye, whom to serve and with how much effort.
There's an aspect of, one, your life is not your own, but two, your life will be as full. The fullness of your life will correlate directly to the amount of your life that is sacrificed. And I forget, I heard somebody talking about that at one point, but that really kind of struck with me, as it's because that is the inverse of the way that we think. Self-help and all this kind of stuff, and not self-help in the category of like I need to take care of like physical fitness so I can provide, but it's like, the more that you're worried about yourself, the more you're worried about if other people have slighted you, or like if you've had an unfair disadvantage or something like that. The more that you do that, it just crushes your spirit. And the more you push those things away and say, I'm going to go provide for this, for that, like that's when you feel, enlightened. That's when you feel, kind of invigorated.
Right. And to be worried about like rights being taken away from us as men is, I understand that concern. And we live in a culture that very much wants to strip men of their uniqueness and their so-called rights, but no one can take away that which is at the heart of masculinity. No one can keep a man from using himself as an instrument for the good of others. No one can take that sacrificial heart away from masculinity. So there is, just like you said, there's no fear then. We don't need to respond from a place of fear that someone is taking our rights away or whatever. But we can respond with that courage, that intentionality, that willingness to be, to exist for the good of those around us.
Well, it's almost like the examples of, you hear them in, different battles. You'll hear about this, or prisoner of war camps, or things like that, where people will continually act out boldly for the sake of those around them. You hear the stories of, I forget the names, right? But there's all these great tales of individuals, battles heightened, things aren't looking good, and they're running back and forth carrying people, from the front lines, putting their life at risk. And you say, okay, well, what is that? Well, that's a testing one. I mean, how unfair, you're 23 years old and here you are probably facing your death because of a battle, a war that you didn't start and all this. Like there's a great picture of injustice being done.
Right.
And how do they respond? Well, the only thing they can control, and the only thing they're called to control, isn't whether or not this grand injustice is going to take place, but how are they going to respond in that moment? And they still have that opportunity to live out that sacrificial calling, right? And to live a perfect masculinity, maybe not perfect, but to gesture towards that in that moment of injustice.
Right.
So did you find the quote, Bennett? Okay. We'll look at it at break. And actually, I've got a couple other ones I might want to throw your way and hear your thoughts. But so maybe we can take a little bit of a step back. We're talking here about masculinity and femininity, right? And the way that these work together, right? This is applicable to the feminine because the feminine desperately wants the masculine to be masculine. You know, that's the best thing that can happen in their life, is to find a proper masculine. Maybe we can go back, and if you can walk through a little bit of the history in maybe where we found ourselves now, where these ideals have been kind of muddied. You know, there's a lot of confusion around these topics, but it didn't just happen in the last 5 years, right? This is something that goes back. So if you want to maybe walk us through how we got here, I think you mentioned maybe going back to the Industrial Revolution, or maybe going back to the garden, however you want to
well, I mean, we really could go to both places. So when in the fall, Adam is really the first feminist. He's the first egalitarian, and these are so these are the two competing worldviews. When we look at humanity, do we see all people as interchangeable one with another? That is, there's no distinction between being man and woman. There's no roles assigned based on biology. That's egalitarianism. So
interchangeability is just a good concise.
Not just like an equality between the sexes, like both made in the image of God, both bearing a dignity, having been made by a creator. There's an equality to that, right? All loved, men and women loved by Jesus equally. Salvation available to all. There is an equality in that regard, but egalitarianism as a worldview sees men and women as sort of interchangeable cogs in the same machine. And then the inverse to that, the worldview we see in the account of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, is complementarity. So, you know, complement with an E, like two angles that add up to 90 degrees. When you put them together, they are more than just the sum of their parts, more than just the sum of two people brought into relationship, right? So 90-degree angle is the strongest angle that you could have. And so two angles that together add up to 90 are much stronger than if you added two angles that are not complementary, right? So when God makes man and woman in his image, after his likeness, the first command he gives to them is be fruitful and multiply. And that only can happen in their complementarity, in their coming together, where they're not interchangeable, where you can't be fruitful and multiply if you have two Adams or two Eves. But it's not just sexual complementarity, which, I mean, we understand at a very basic level sexual complementarity, right? So you go to the hardware store and you're gonna, buy some pipe fittings for your house. You're gonna buy, female fittings into which you can put a male pipe. So there are some dimensions of society where we haven't completely lost our minds yet. I've said before, there's no same-sex marriage in the pipe fitters union. Some remnants of sanity. And then in Genesis 2, that we get a further window into this complementarity in even the way in which Adam and Eve are created. So Adam made out of the dirt, and then God observes that no helper who fits him is found. And so what he needs is his complement. He needs someone who fits him. And so this isn't just sexual complementarity. This is also like an emotional complementarity. It's a physical complementarity. It's a complementarity of work and roles, so that when God brings them together, you get the first recorded words of mankind, at last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. There's goodness and safety within that complementarity. So the two of them are more than just two people brought into relationship. So man and woman together are the way in which the two become one flesh. The two together build a home, build a neighborhood, around the home, and all of that depends upon their complementarity, right? And so we spoke of emotional complementarity. Every child knows this naturally, and that is, that's a thing. God, even just pure nature should teach us of this complementarity. We should know that the only way a new life is brought into the world is in the union of a sperm and an egg, right? From man and from woman is the only way that happens. And a child has a biological, natural law kind of right to these two complementary parents, not just generally two adults to raise him, but two parents, so that, when you fall off your bike and skin your knee, you then have a choice, presumably, which parent you're going to go to. And because they are complementary and not interchangeable, there's no sameness between mom and dad, you might pick the parent who is more nurturing, who is more tender in that moment. If you run to dad, he might just tell you to rub some dirt on it.
Yeah.
Which is necessary, right? I mean, so, and again, biology just teaches this. So the parent in the state of Illinois, we our birth certificates say we have a birthing parent and a non-birthing parent. I kid you not. It's the most horrible thing in the world. So the one who has given life to this child is always going to be more nurturing. But the one who has stood outside, whose masculinity calls him outside of himself, will always be sort of beckoning the child out into the world, calling him to take risks, to learn how to navigate the world around him. And that's necessary. A child needs both. So those are, broadly speaking, the two competing worldviews. And I would say egalitarianism is just dull and gray. Like, if you look at the world, and every human being is interchangeable one with another, there's no nuance. There's no beauty there. There's no compelling story there. But with a complementarian worldview, where men and women are different, and there's excitement, there's beauty, there's goodness, there's thrill when a man and woman are brought together. That's a worldview that sees the world in color, and not in the dull grayness of egalitarianism. So those are your two competing worldviews. And we obviously in the fall see Adam being an egalitarian, right? When the serpent comes to Eve, he should have stomped his head right there, but he doesn't. He lets Eve respond to the devil with the word of God. He's the first one to allow a woman preacher. If Adam can use the word, then Eve can wield the word just the same. And when it comes time to bear responsibility for sin, again, a complementarian would say, as Christ does for his bride, the church, it's all my fault. It's all on me. Take all of her sin and her shortcoming and credit that to me, and I will pay the price for that. Instead, Adam says, the woman whom you gave to me, she gave to me and I ate. So since the fall, then, mankind has always been lured into egalitarianism. Which is an inverse. Yes. Yeah. And so it comes and goes in waves throughout history. And we see cultures rise and fall. Usually the decline happens the more they embrace egalitarianism. But none of that is our cultural moment. So nothing is new in the world. But what we are experiencing is very much new to us, right? This is the first time all of us are living through this sort of wave of egalitarianism. So in our American experiment, where does it come from? Nancy Pearcey, in her book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, asks the question, how did we as a culture come to a point of being able to say that masculinity is toxic?
Mm-hmm.
And she locates it all the way back in the Industrial Revolution. That before the Industrial Revolution, every household is its own kind of economy. So husband and wife, mom and dad, children, all labor towards a common goal, whatever the household is producing.
Mm-hmm.
And they do so, embracing their different responsibilities for that final product. And when the Industrial Revolution happens, we take men out of the homes where, if he's a cobbler, he's a specialist in all dimensions of shoes,
Mm-hmm.
right? He can look at your foot and he can craft a shoe that will fit your foot. When you come to him with a shoe that needs a part replaced, the leather is worn through here. He can repair. He can fix. He can identify what's wrong with his product because he's made it. When you take him out of the home, then the factory no longer wants a generalist. They don't want a cobbler who knows all dimensions of the shoe. They only want a guy who can, pull the lever and stamp out the toe cap.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want the guy who does the toe cap to know anything about the lacing, because then he's going to leave his area. He's going to leave his domain, and be interested in how the lacing is done,
Mm-hmm.
or how the shoes are sewn together. But you don't want him to do that. He just pull the lever as efficiently as possible, stamp out as many toe caps. So,
Which is detrimental to the spirit.
completely. And so it takes away some of his humanity, right? When God puts Adam in the garden, he puts him in the garden to work it and to keep it. He has responsibility for all creation. He's given dominion over all creation. But then if you just tell him, here's your row in the garden, just keep the weeds from growing here, it diminishes his call and his humanity. So that happens to man. And then also there's all the complications that come from the differences between working in the home and working in the factory, right? Like the home is never efficient.
Mm-hmm.
It's always, relationally dependent. And, dad teaching his kids how to do a task in the home is always slower,
Mm-hmm.
always takes more time, and there are more mistakes to fix in the end than it is for dad to just do the same task over and over. It's far less efficient, relationally dependent, but it's not just what the household is making, right? So the household is its own little economy, but it's also its own little schoolhouse.
Mm-hmm.
It's its own little church, right? So it's its own little state in a sense. But when dad is gone during the day, children are learning apart from dad. They're being catechized apart from dad. They're being ruled apart from dad. And then dad comes home from the factory and he has to sort of reinsert himself into family life, which requires a complete shift in his way of thinking and seeing the world. And it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
So Piercy says, men are tempted then, instead of coming straight home from the factory, they can go with their work buddies to the bar,
Mm-hmm.
or the tavern or the brothel.
Because they're used to being away from home.
Right.
They're
right.
kind of,
It's just easier.
yeah.
So, or he comes home and, dinner is complicated. The kids have all of their needs. And it's just overwhelming. So it's easier for him then to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get political cartoons of the age that show like dad leaving the hearth again, having come home from the factory, and then he leaves, and you have, mom pleading with him not to go back out to the tavern. And so this gives birth then to the temperance movement, and we're painting with broad strokes.
Yeah, we can pause right there because I think there's a lot there just to learn, even in the way we operate our own households.
Oh,
right?
sure.
So, I mean, one thing you make me reflect on is I've learned just over the last couple of years that my favorite day will be a day where, maybe I don't go into the office and maybe I've got yard work going on, right? So I'm at home, I'm doing yard work. Our young kids will come in and out. My son Lincoln will help for a little bit. Eileen will come, help do this thing, and then they go play.
Yeah.
So there's times where they're naturally learning from me. There's times where I'm present and, I'm pulled over to go engage in this thing. And then I'm back to working on the house. And then when I'm finished, I know I can see tangibly the works of my hands helping our home, right? Like maybe things are more organized or the yard's cleaned up or, whatever it is. And there's kind of peace in the household, and the evening seems to always go really well there. So whereas when I'm pulled away from the household and I've been busy all day and I come back, especially if it's kind of taxing type tasks, it's not something where I'm able to kind of craft something, if I've maybe finished an article or something like that, then I can, I've done this thing.
Right.
And that feels rewarding. Right. So your spirit's a little bit, enlightened there. But yeah, the taxing is certainly where I've drawn away. I've done something that feels mundane and I can't see the final product. And then I go home and kids have not seen me, wife hasn't seen me. And I can see that play out in some days, and I can see the healthy aspect play out in some days. But you're saying pre-industrial revolution, the cobbler or whatever, he's at home, he's working on this. His 5-year-old son can come in and he can help with a little bit, and he can show that. And the son respects the father. The father's making bonds with the son. He's able to go and, take a little hour break and, play with his daughters, and his wife's there and they have lunch. So everything's oriented towards the home.
Right.
And that gives fulfillment. It gives relational strength. You can see how that's healthy. And I like how you're kind of saying it's its own little city.
Yeah.
Right. That's, yeah. You make me long for that.
And I mean, part of our work as pastors, it's not going off to the factory, but you said it a second ago, so much of what we do is intangible. I mean, our kids can hear the sermon on Sunday morning that we've spent time during the week crafting, but there's nothing, there's no finished product when sins are forgiven, when we absolve people. They're not done in a sense. So that's, for us too, there's a need for man to have something that he can accomplish, something where there's a finished product and he can say, this is complete. Now it's on to the next thing. Now it's to the next task.
I love going on we got a split level, so the upper deck, and I'll finish mowing and I'll grab a Boston logger and I'll go out there and I'll just look at the lawn. It's so rewarding,
Yeah.
Because you can't do at the end of a sermon, you just gotta go home and you're like, well,
right.
Hope that was good. I hope that accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish.
You can't see the nice rows mowed in the grass. Yeah.
But when you can look at the grass, you're like, that makes sense. It didn't look like that 3 hours ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we take a break to use the restroom?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right.
So we are back.
All right.
So, nice. Yeah, I don't know how much was caught there, but maybe we can circle back to some of that when we did find the quote. We won't go to it yet. If I remember right, we had kind of gone through the Industrial Revolution, and then we're transitioning to the kind of temperance movement. Is that right? It's kind of falling
so broad strokes. I mean, there's a lot more nuance here, but broadly speaking, the Industrial Revolution gives birth to the temperance movement, which is, woman's desire, not just to keep man from drinking, but to return him to the hearth. So closing down the saloons just becomes a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. It's just if we take away choices from man, then he has to return home. He has to re-engage with his family. He has to do the hard work, but the meaningful work of, raising his children, catechizing them, overseeing their schoolwork, tucking them in at night, saying bedtime prayers with them. He has to do all those things. So the temperance movement becomes the means by which that goal is pursued. But no man who would prefer to go to the saloon than to go home is going to vote to outlaw alcohol. So the temperance movement gives birth to the women's suffrage movement, which, at the forefront, you see, all these egalitarian voices. But there's a fascinating essay by an Episcopalian priest around the time that women's suffrage is being introduced. And
women's suffrage is women's voting.
Yes, yeah. And so there had been a poll, I think in Massachusetts. I forget, this article used to be available for free. It was an Atlantic article, Why Women Do Not Desire the Vote, I think was the name of it. I forget the author off the top of my head. I think they've since I started telling people to go find it, I think they've put it behind a paywall now. Not really, like 3 people have looked it up since I said to go look for it, and they're like, "Oh, why did we leave this out there in the ether?" But so
Jeff found it.
Yeah, he's asking the question because they had conducted a poll, like asking women, "Do you want the right to vote?" And his argument is that voting is really an exercise of it's sort of like a military exercise. What does voting do except protect the state and protect the home? So we think of it in very like innocuous terms nowadays, but it really is kind of an exercise of protecting. So voting, not that different from a military exercise. So he said women, the reason that they voted overwhelmingly not to want the vote must be because they're having this male exercise foisted upon them. But nevertheless,
so that they kind of intrinsically recognize this is supposed to be the masculine,
right?
Like this is their job,
right.
In the same way going to war is their job.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we expect men to protect us, which means their vote is part and parcel of their protective work for us. So the average woman understood it that way, but it's being pushed upon them by the egalitarian voices, leading the charge for women's suffrage, which is to say, every person ought to have a vote, not just that every household ought to be represented. So that's where women's suffrage comes from. That's how temperance finally becomes enacted, and then that gives birth, of course, to the various waves of feminism, which sought to give to women the same sort of dehumanizing privileges that were given to men in the Industrial Revolution, right? So his value as a human being then is reduced to the number on the pay slip that he brings home. It's not how skilled he is in the family, in the household economy anymore. And so this devalued what was going on in the household. And so women then were sold this same bill of goods that if you want to be a valuable contributor to this family, and if you want this same kind of personal fulfillment that your husband has when he takes his briefcase and gets in the car and leaves the home for the 8 hours of the workday, then what you need is to do exactly the same.
So they painted the thing that was actually a dehumanizing of the masculine as the ideal, and
right.
sold it to the feminine.
Right. Yeah. So we've never, the question is that we're sort of asking is, should a woman work outside the home? But we're never actually asking the question behind that. Should a man work outside the home? Which, the nature of our economy is such that many people will have to work outside the home. But we are seeing like a resistance to this in the gig economy, in the work from home kind of economy. So maybe we're on the cusp of something new.
People have
where
a taste of coming back in the home. And
where
at
not
first they were
everyone
like, this is crazy. And then they're like, actually, this is nice. Yeah.
where not everyone has to, scuttle all your work into a leather satchel and go away for the day.
Yeah. So the narrative's kind of breaking apart a little bit as
Yeah.
people get a little bit of a taste of this, pre-industrial. And you guys have a hobby farm.
Well,
Or you're working on it.
Yeah.
And
We have that goal in mind.
Yeah, but I feel like most people we talk to, that's at least their goal, whether they're going to attain that or not. But, there are areas, like I said, kind of on the outskirts of the suburbs, and so many people are moving away from the city and from that hustle and bustle, and they want kind of this little bit more land, but their ultimate goal is to go a little bit further west and go out and get a hobby farm. And they don't necessarily, in our area, able to pull it off. Land's kind of expensive, but there's that goal. Like they see that as enticing.
Yeah. But not even just farming, right? I mean, so much of like, YouTube or Instagram or these social media areas are like creator space, like people teaching others how to make something. Or you have, like something like Etsy where, all of a sudden your little household economy making whatever your widget is, you have access to a much broader market than the people who might travel up your driveway. So there is, great opportunity now for households to be economies again. And for, it's not just, mom's side gig while dad is at the office. You can have, like a woodworking or a leatherworking or metalworking or whatever, even content creation in the social media sphere is its own kind of like work from home kind of thing. So there are lots of opportunities for people to sort of check out of the 9-to-5 workplace, which is like anthropologically refreshing. Good for us as human beings to see the work of our hands, and to have the people of our household be obviously and principally the beneficiaries of that work, instead of I'm working for someone else's corporation and the people back at home are only served secondarily or tertiarily when I bring home this paycheck with which we can do the things that our household requires.
I think it's Chesterton who says all jobs serve the one job.
Yeah.
And the one job is, he ties it back to the mother in the household, right?
Yeah.
So like, why do people go to war? Why do people step into government positions? Why do we create, things that can be sold? And it's all to support that household and the mother raising the children, So the closer you're connected to that core, the more fulfillment you're going to have, the more you're external from that. And you're just doing things, you can think if you're doing it without a family, for instance, and it's so that you can buy new things or go on new trips and that becomes, you're just serving yourself, but you're removed from that ultimate calling.
Yeah. Yeah. So, even the person to whom God hasn't given a family, even for him, it's still not good for man to be alone.
Yeah.
So he needs to find those whom the Lord has given him to serve, or he needs to find those opportunities for him to use his masculine energy and strength and virility to be of service to those around him. So the local congregation is a great place to find those kinds of things, but communities as a whole, our cities are places where there is a desperate need for the strength of young men. There's a father hole in so many societal institutions. There's a need for the strength and the prowess and the skill and the sacrifice of young men in a variety of institutions. If God hasn't given you a family, you have opportunity to do something helpful for others where dad or husband is absent.
Yeah. So even if you don't have your own family, you can serve the families.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's good. So temperance movement, anything else to touch on there? I don't know if we completed it. That was tied into women's suffrage. Right?
Yeah, and then that becomes the suffrage movement, and then we get the various, that's sort of first wave feminism, and then we get second wave feminism that says That would give women the right or the responsibility to work outside the home. And then we get sort of third wave feminism, and I wonder if it's sort of self-defeating, if we've seen sort of the last waves of feminism as a result of our really finally buying into this egalitarian mentality, that now not only are men and women interchangeable, but now there is a fluidity between both, right? And so you see, the transgender movement is the thorn in the side, really, of like third wave feminism, that wants to exalt women and give them, a status without the responsibility of a man, without his input or cooperation at all. But now to compete in women's sports, you've got to be a biological male who identifies as a woman, right? So it undoes everything feminism has been fighting for. And so now the transgender movement labels feminists like J.K. Rowling as a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist. Like you're a radical feminist who didn't get far enough. But it's the lie sort of undoing itself.
Yeah, it's like they've created something to their undoing.
Yeah,
or I don't know. I'm going to keep going back to Lord of the Rings, but the Balrog, right? Where it's like they delved too deep and they awakened something that was to their demise. Yeah, bringing it to its logical completion. So where does that kind of those waves have come, and then and you're kind of painting the picture of where we're at now. Do you want to speak any more to the issues that are at hand, or do you want to move to kind of the remedy?
To the question of masculinity, this has led to a generation of young men who've grown up in this egalitarian world, who've been told by culture over and over again that masculinity is toxic, that it's harmful, that there's no distinction between the sexes when it comes to roles given to them. And so you're seeing young men sort of reject that narrative altogether. And so this explains the popularity of someone like Jordan Peterson among young men, for instance. Someone who's just willing to say there is an inherent goodness to your maleness, and there are constructive outlets towards which that strength and vigor can be directed. Peterson, of course, obviously not a Christian, so misses the sort of biblical reality of masculinity. But Peterson's a lot healthier for young men than the pickup artist culture that they were buying into a decade ago, or Andrew Tate sort of exemplifies what that has become.
Who's Andrew Tate?
So Andrew Tate was a kickboxer and made millions of dollars, according to his own boasting, with a webcam model business.
Okay.
And so he's been in a lot of legal trouble lately.
Is he bald?
Yeah.
Does a lot of things shirtless?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
I'll see him pop up in places. I'm like, I don't know who this guy is, but okay. So
super popular with young men. Teenage and 20-something young men really gravitate to someone like Andrew Tate, who I think exemplifies the opposite of masculinity. So because he built his fortune using young women as a means to his own end, for his own good. And so this is what has him in a lot of legal trouble, pimping young women for his webcam model business, and selling to young men giving them, he's had a variety of names for the online content that he sells, but it's all just the pickup artist community repackaged, with a new title on it. And all that, pickup artist community is just selfishness being, leveraged to get a woman into your bed. So it's really it's using her as a means for your own fulfillment, your own, another notch in your bedpost or whatever.
So it's kind of the other side of the issue of driving a wedge and causing one of the genders to hate the other one, right?
Yeah, well,
which can happen on the feminine side, but on the masculine one, it's like you actually despise the woman, and therefore you want
Yes.
to use her for your own gain.
Yes.
And that's one of the things with pornography is it's about taking something beautiful
Yeah.
and defiling it,
Yeah.
and there's a demonic desire there, and that's what draws people in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hating the personhood of woman and reducing her to, a collection of body parts
Mhm.
or pixels on a screen.
Mhm.
But conversely, I think, the same is true of like young women on OnlyFans or something.
Mhm.
That there is also a despisal of the masculine in their using what God has given them, their feminine beauty, to just make money off of the depravity of men.
Mhm.
So there's a despisal on both ends.
Yeah.
Men hating women, using women as a means to his sense of fulfillment, and women hating men, using men as a means to their own fulfillment.
Mhm.
I mean, that really is the perfect picture of our cultural moment.
Mhm. But do you see rising up underneath that? Do you see kind of a resurgence of health? With people like Jordan Peterson and
Yeah.
and others have kind of are you optimistic that I mean, it's got to self-destruct at some point, right? It's cancerous, but
Yes.
yeah. Where do you see? How do you see that playing out?
So there is a resurgence of young men seeking out traditional Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
In Orthodox Lutheranism,
Mm-hmm.
In traditional Roman Catholicism,
The Latin Mass. And,
yeah, and I think that's attractive to young men because it's so far removed from this cultural narrative that they've just been swimming in for their entire upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just very much a breath of fresh air.
Mm-hmm.
And complementarity is beautiful and good because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord eventually,
Mhm.
some joyfully and some begrudgingly,
Mhm.
right? We're all going to realize the truth and the beauty of this complementarian worldview, either in the end begrudgingly, or we discover it now gratefully. So we are seeing young men, I think, discovering that they have a drive within them to do something purposeful,
Mm-hmm.
and for the good of others. There's just something chiseled into the DNA of man, right? We still tell stories of courage and sacrifice. We still give out the Medal of Honor, for
Mhm,
instance, right? And that honors someone who has done something exemplary in in war
Mm-hmm.
for the good of others,
Mhm.
to the denial of self. Like that's still latent within all of our genes.
Mm-hmm.
And so young men are discovering that Christianity gives a sense of purpose to their masculine drive to be something good for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing, yeah, hearing that redeemed in the church, having their sins removed by Jesus and seeing in him an example of masculinity, we are seeing like a resurgence among young men rejecting this sort of cultural nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're sort of asking, now where are the young women?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably half a generation behind,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of how things go, I think.
Yeah.
So once women realize that this is where the good, reliable men are, she has within her that desire to be safe underneath the headship of man as well. Right? I mean, to go back to Ephesians 5, Paul addresses the command to submit, not to husbands, but to wives. Not husbands, get your wives to submit, but he addresses it to wives. And I think, she looks at the church, who is her example for what a godly submission looks like, and there is something within her as well. She knows that femininity at its core is receptive, and under a head who is safe, who is for her good, like what Paul will say, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Submission under a head who is like Christ is the safest place for her to be, and affords her the most opportunity for her feminine flourishing as well. So I think that just naturally will happen, however many years, 5-10 years down the road, women will realize, look, there are great young men in the church, and we'll begin to see their shift away from the cultural narrative as well.
Yeah. I got a couple of thoughts and questions there. Let's take a quick break and then we'll pop into those.
Sounds good.
All right. Bennett says, we're back again.
All right.
So, as you're talking about that, I think maybe one of the core aspects of that is that this is the desire of both genders for them to be kind of put back into their proper place. And one observation, I've had friends that have this dynamic where the husband is much more passive and not kind of a passive strength, but much more like submissive.
Yeah, right.
And the wife is kind of assertive. And in some aspects, she kind of crafts that early on in the relationship, as I watch.
Yeah.
And then she hates it. Like she
right.
wants her husband to be the type of person that she can look up to and respect.
Yeah.
But she's kind of beaten him into submission, and then she despises him for it.
Yeah.
Right. Which is another example of like you've created something to your own demise.
Right. Right.
I don't know if you see those kind of observations of, when this is tried, it's unenjoyable for both sides.
Yeah. And she, I mean, just speaking generally of that relationship, the reason she begins that sort of taking the assertive role in the relationship is because that's what the culture around her, that's what her mother and her grandmother and all these waves of feminism have told her that she is to do, right? Be the leader in your relationship, but then she tries it and she finds it's really not fulfilling. That's not at the core of her being. That's not who she's designed to be. But also right? He's told men are to be nice. And to go along and to give deference to your wife or your girlfriend or whatever, even though that the culture has told him exactly that's what you are to do, and it's so very counter to his being as well. So you end up with both people unhappy in that relationship, and neither one really knows how to fix it.
Yeah, we observed my wife was there too, so she kind of observed that. And it was a couple probably in their 60s or so. And, they were kind of commenting on something. And, the mother or the wife said, she's like, no, like what I say goes in that area, and the dynamic of the relationship was, she kind of asserted that it was true. And you could tell that the husband, his identity was kind of built in things outside of the house, just kind of being a fun guy and, drinking beer and stuff like that. And then kind of making little like sarcastic jabs.
Right.
And you could see it was like she had kind of created this authority here, which removed him from the situation.
Yeah.
And the only thing he could do is be kind of the sarcastic person. But he found his identity by being sarcastic and by, doing things external to the family unit, which was causing a lot of pain on both sides.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the phrase, happy wife, happy life?
I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what makes her happy? I mean, the phrase is predicated upon this idea of men, the deferent man, the one who gives in to whatever his wife wants, and that will make her happy, and then he can have a happy life. It's not different from the idea of a man cave or something like that, a place where a man goes to get away from the overbearing wife, or the tedium of children, a place to just go check out, have a beer, watch the game, whatever. So it's not really happy. It's sort of I don't know. Maybe it's what our modern notion of happiness is, but that's just so superficial. I used to. I have repented of it, but at least in one sermon, I called Thomas Jefferson a liar for saying that our Creator has endowed us with the right to pursue happiness. Because happiness sounds so superficial to us, but this happiness, it's really in Greek, it's eudaimonia, and it's more than just superficial happiness. It's contentment, and Jefferson, of course, is drawing on the virtue philosophers before, for whom the whole of a man's life was virtue in a quest of, manliness that would lead to this eudaimonia. So
it's like fulfillment.
Yeah, exactly. Or like the 9th and 10th commandments teach us, contentment, a gratitude, to use a trendy word, for what God gives in the moment. And for the philosophers, that was only attainable by means of virtue. And so that of course is what Jefferson is speaking of when he talks about, our Creator has given us this right to pursue happiness, contentment, fulfillment, that comes by means of having a purpose in life. So the issue with happy wife, happy life, is that we've settled for this superficial idea of happiness. So if we just manufacture this veneer of happiness, we make our lives look like our Pinterest board, or our wives' Pinterest board, or something like that, then we'll all be happy and content. But there's no fulfillment in that. There's no purpose in that, right? So a man is not using himself as an instrument for the good of his wife. He's rather, using, sort of checking out, letting his wife determine what is her own good. And if she says it's good for her, then if he's hands off and let her do what she wants, then that must be good for him as well.
Can you speak to virtue and just the importance of virtue, both in this, but also in the Christian life, and highlighting these?
And this is what's fascinating for the philosophers, is that virtue is a distinctly manly thing, and so it was the goal of a man's life, to attain this happiness by means of virtue, and so society has created various lists of virtue throughout time. From the Christian perspective, we have virtues inherent in the commandments, of course, or there were you have the seven deadly sins that are offset by 7 cardinal virtues, and so it's either man is either exercising this vice, this particular sin, or he's leaning into virtue. So virtue is essentially manly. The root of the word vir is man in Latin, and so virtue always orients a man outside of himself. Elsewhere, I've said that the essence of masculinity is not rugged independence, it's sacrificial giving. That masculinity exists in an intersection, not in merely possessing male characteristics, but in the intersection of those male characteristics with virtue. So God makes men strong. Their bodies produce testosterone 10 times that of their sisters, of their mothers, of their daughters. Men have a natural inclination to amass and use tools, right? Be they actual, snap-on wrenches or firearms or trucks or whatever, right? Men, I mean, we just see this, men collect tools, but that's not the end in and of itself, right? The tool exists for the good of someone else, right? And so that's virtue, is using those male characteristics: strength, prowess, risk-taking, using tools, even the way that a man thinks, his ability to see things spatially. All of that is intended to be used for the good of others. So
it has to be rooted in that humility rather than pride, contentedness rather than envy, and then, well, got courage. I don't think contentedness is one of the 7 cardinal virtues, but yeah, hope, faith, love. Yeah. Anyway, so those are the things that kind of give a content to the way you exercise those things.
Exactly.
Because you can do it in a prideful way,
right?
Or in a way to go grasp things for yourself in an envious way,
right?
Or you can do it in a way that kind of flows from this contentedness and this other orientedness.
Yeah. And how perfect then for the Christian man whose identity in Christ is secure and whose masculinity in Christ is secure. Right, all the baptized are made sons of God in the waters of baptism, given a certain inheritance in the waters of baptism. And so for men then, they have the confidence knowing that God the Father already sees them as good men. And so we don't sort of have to prove ourselves in that arena. We already are. And so there's the the freedom to sort of try and fail, in the realm of sanctification. There's the courage that being forgiven gives us to live for the good of others.
Yeah,
that we never have to prove ourselves. We are already proven. And so we have a Father who says of us, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And knowing we have the Father's pleasure for the sake of Jesus, we're free to sort of play around in life, to sort of enjoy the pursuit of the good of others, knowing that our identity is secure.
Yeah, and you can see how that is, I think, just you can observe it, that is a necessary piece for you not to have pride. Right. So, I mean, you can think about pride is always competitive. One of my favorite tests is always, okay, when you meet somebody in the first couple minutes, what are the things that you feel like you have to bring up?
Yeah.
I'm this, I went to school here, this is where I work, or, this is what I drive, or, so in other words, that motivation to place your accomplishments, and put it before other people, or to kind of compete, if somebody else kind of talks about an accomplishment, do you feel a sting from that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are all kind of they're symptoms of the pride. So how do you actually cut that where you don't feel like you actually need to, prove yourself to other people? And it's got to be a very stable type of identity. And how do you get an identity that's not based on the things that you are accomplishing? And the only way is if you can receive that identity.
Right.
So once that's been received, it orients you to say, okay, now the things that I do isn't about building a resume, isn't about earning favor in other people's eyes. It is about doing and accomplishing the things for the people that God has put in my life.
Yeah. And even competitiveness is like a male characteristic, right? So that's a perfect example of how, this male characteristic may be used for good or for ill. If when I meet someone, I feel the need to assert myself over against him, to say, no, I really am. I'm the better man here. That's to not only his harm, but my harm as well. But competitiveness between men ought really push one another on towards something better. Right. So when men are pushing each other in the gym, for instance, or in business, is the goal just that you can strut around in the gym like a rooster, knowing that no one can pick up as much weight off the floor as you can, or is the goal that you can return from there a strong and stable father and husband, for the good of those people, that you can get down on the floor and wrestle with your kids because you can pick up 400 pounds on the barbell.
There's a great picture in that hideous strength, and then I do want to get to this quote here and hear your thoughts. Where there's, I forget the two names of them, but they're two of the kind of like the chief people of this NICE institution, which is, as you find it, it's all pride and competitiveness. And there's like this unhealthy hierarchy to where there's a healthy hierarchy in this kind of angelic type organization over here, which is St. Anne's, right? So Lewis is playing on the type of hierarchy that is of hell and the type of hierarchy that is of heaven. And in this one, it's always competitiveness and hatred. And that's what draws excuse me, the people to work together, is their constant motivation to kind of one up the other one. And at the very end, it's I forget the names of the two individuals. I think it's Frost and the guy that starts with a W. But the way that they kind of end their story, they're kind of caught in this like hateful embrace of like wrestling, and it's like this picture of what they've been doing throughout the entire story. As it seems like they're working together, but really they're despising each other and waiting for the other one to be destroyed. Can I jump into this quote?
Yeah, absolutely.
Goodness, let's see if I can read this here. Okay, so this is long, so I'm going to try to maybe summarize a little bit of it. So this is at the end of Paralandra, where Ransom, who's the main character, sees Malacandra and Paralandra. Malacandra is Mars, and Paralandra is Venus, which is where the second book takes place. First one was in Malacandra. And point being, in the way he sets this up is the planet and the angel that is ahead of the planet is kind of one and the same. So at this moment, he sees kind of the unveiling of Malacandra and of Paralandra, which is really masculinity and femininity. Okay, so he sees them kind of they take on a type of human form. And then he's he's observing what each one looks like. But as he's doing this, what Lewis is really doing is trying to paint poetically what the difference between masculinity and femininity are. Let's see, he says, he has said that Malacandra, which is masculine, was like rhythm, and Paralandra like melody. He said that Malacandra affected him like a quantitative, Paralandra like an accentual meter. He thinks that the first, the masculine, held in his hands something like a spear, but the hands of the other were open with the palms towards him. But I don't know that any of these attempts has helped me. At all events, what Ransom saw at that moment was the real meaning of gender. Then he goes on, he says, what is masculine about a mountain or feminine about certain trees? He talks about the philological phenomenon. So like, the way that we have masculine words and feminine words. And then he goes on, I want to give you one more aspect here and then hear your thoughts. Let's see. Let's go ahead and pause there because I'm going to get lost here and all this other stuff. All right, no, here it is. Malacandra seemed to him to have the look of one standing armed at the ramparts of his own remote, archaic world in a ceaseless vigilance, his eyes ever roaming the earthward horizon whence his danger came long ago. A sailor's look, Ransom once said to me. Eyes that are impregnated with distance. But the eyes of Paralandra opened, as it were, inward, as if they were the curtained gateway to a world of waves and murmurings and wandering airs, of life that rocked in winds and splashed on mossy stones, and descended as the dew and arose sunward in thin-spun delicacy of mist. On Mars, the very forests are of stone. In Venus, the lands swim. Thoughts on some of that imagery?
Yeah, so, especially at the end there with man's eyes fixated outward, and the feminine gaze sort of fixated inward. This can only happen in their complementarity, right? And further confirms how if you just have two people, gazing outward, or you just have two people gazing inward, you're missing the necessity of one with the other, male and female together. So when man has his gaze fixated outward and woman's gaze fixated inward, his sacrificial calling orients him outside himself. Hers orients her inward toward the family. There's safety in that. He knows that he can do what he's given to do because she's attending to what she's given to do, and she knows that she is safe to do what she's given to do because he's attending to the work given him to do.
And the life and the vibrance in that too is within the feminine, right? That's where the lands are kind of bursting. That's where the plants are, so there's this, that's where the beauty is, right?
Yeah.
And then the man's kind of this rocky exterior that allows the feminine to, that's where life is taking place. That's where life is born out of. That's where, the home is.
Right. And she is always to be protected.
Yeah.
He is always expendable.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't this even the nature of biology itself? Like when a girl is born, an infant baby girl, she has all the eggs that she will ever have for her entire lifetime. Whereas a man produces sperm, all throughout his fertile years. And so there's sort of no limit to that, which makes him expendable.
Mm-hmm.
It's why we always send our men to fight wars, and we keep our women home to be guarded and protected.
Can you speak to Pete Hegseth and kind of have you followed the conversations that are going on there?
Only a little bit.
Okay.
And just refresh me a little. He said he's less inclined to have women as war fighters, right?
I think he's even said he's completely against it, which of course has caused a little bit of an uprising. And he's basically, his response was really great at one point, because I think a reporter kind of like, how dare you say that? And he's like, listen, I don't report to you. I report to the voters that put, the president in office who appointed me.
Yeah.
And here's my stance. And he's stuck to it. Now, what's going to take place from that? I'm not sure.
Right.
But it is refreshing just to hear someone willing to say that out loud.
Yeah.
And within the church, we need to be able to say that out loud.
Yeah.
It's, I think, a real crime when we don't say that, when we kind of make us interchangeable to the degree where we are content with having our women go die.
Right.
While we stay at home and are accountants or something like that.
His body just does not do what hers does.
Mm-hmm.
Hers holds within it new life,
mm-hmm.
nascent life, just waiting to be brought from the safety of her womb out into sort of the harshness of the world. And she, at least for the first month of her pregnancy, will not know that she's expecting. Mm-hmm. So there's always a risk that if we send our young women to combat, we're sending not one life but two.
Never thought about that.
So there's always that danger,
mm-hmm.
that she's not just defending herself but also the life within her,
mm-hmm.
and it's just so unnatural for her, right? That's where she's oriented towards the life that grows within her. She will do whatever it takes, right? I mean, the mama bear meme is true,
mm-hmm.
That you don't come between a woman and her child. She will do whatever is necessary to protect that child. He doesn't carry life within himself, so he's always oriented outward, fixated on the good of another. So he is just more expendable in warfare than she is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so that's how societies have thrived in the past, is by sending their young, unmarried, childless men to fight their wars for them,
mm-hmm.
to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned earlier, like, vocation is kind of like a target, and at the center, you can prioritize your callings in life by whether you can leave that calling without sin or not.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the table of duties in the Catechism prioritizes our vocations in this way as well. That, the first calling laid upon every Christian is to be a hearer of the word. And there's no sin-free way to leave that calling behind. So you have pastor and hearer paired together. Then you have husbands and wives, parents and children. And those are all callings that God lays upon us, from which the only way we can depart is by means of sin, right? So the only way to stop being a parent, so to speak, stop being a father, is by sinfully abandoning your children. The only way out of being a husband is by sinfully abandoning your wife, or marriage can be broken by either person. Those vows can be broken either way, but there's no sin-free option for leaving those callings. So those are at the center of the bullseye. Then a man only has one life to spend. He only has 24 hours in every day. He can't lay down his life for every single person who needs him. So how do we prioritize those things? Well, what's at the center? Who is most harmed by his absence? And then I think you're arguing over whether his wife is harmed by his absence more, or his children harmed more by his absence. She could be given another husband, to be sure, but your children can never be given another father in the same way. They have one biological father, right? So you have those right at the center of the bullseye. So not only is it probably improper for women to be fighting combat to defend people that they don't know, right? To establish a state for the good of those far beyond their own homes. But it's probably also improper to be sending fathers to fight when there are young, vigorous men to whom God has not given a wife, to whom He's not given children, who are sort of our prime war fighters.
Can we go through some of the biblical stories that would be good examples of, masculinity, femininity, the relationship of the two? If there's any that you want to explore.
Well, we can start anywhere. We certainly see. Often we learn more by the negative examples than by the positive examples, right? So you have a guy like King David, for instance, easy, low-hanging fruit. In some ways, gets masculinity quite right. So we have strong examples of courage in his fighting Goliath, for instance, but he'll do so not resting on his own strength, but he'll fight cleverly. He won't wear armor that doesn't fit him, doesn't suit him. So you have a great example of masculinity there. You have sort of the honor when he's keeping the fourth commandment towards King Saul, refusing to kill the Lord's anointed, though he's given opportunity to do so. So he knows his place in life. He trusts in the Lord for a sense of identity. So you get a strong, courageous depiction of a man then. But then of course you have the example in the spring when the kings are off to war. You have David not going off to war. So not doing sort of what's incumbent upon kings. Among the other nations at the time, kings go off to war. Well, David is at home, not with his men, and sees Bathsheba bathing. So then he breaks the sixth commandment with her. Aspires to break the fifth commandment.
There's kind of an aspect where I wonder if I haven't thought about this before, but all sin kind of flows from, certainly the breaking of the first commandment, right? But in kind of maybe if you look at it in a different category, sloth is kind of always the first sin, right? If you think about it, like sloth and laziness gives, so in other words, he's not doing what he should be doing, and something has to fill that place.
Right.
If you're doing what you are supposed to be doing, there's kind of a blockade to where like you're not going to sit there and look around lustfully, like you're acting,
right?
But as soon as you become idle, then you're going to act in some way. And
Right.
if you're not doing the good action, it's
Right.
going to end up being the bad action.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's right. I mean, it's like a spiritual sloth to begin with as well. Acedia, an inattentiveness to the Word of God, and a lack of discipline in one's spiritual life that plays out in the other arenas of a man's life as well. So we're not given to know what David's spiritual life at that time is like. I think we can guess that he's inattentive to the Word. If he's more enamored with the comfortable life at home, and then easily given to falling into sin with Bathsheba, and instead of owning his sin and by means of repentance and seeking forgiveness from the Lord, the sinner who's so caught up in himself, so slothful spiritually, his inclination is to cover over his sin by means of more lies, by means of sending Uriah into the front lines to die, presumably along with a host of how many other soldiers died that day because of David's sin. So that spiritual acedia, inattentiveness in the Word, lack of discipline in the Word, gives birth to how many other sins down the road.
Yeah, that is a really good picture, isn't it? And that when you watch through the narrative of David, great accomplishments and the danger after accomplishments, good virtuous accomplishments oriented towards God. The danger is always the comfortability that creeps in.
Yeah.
It's like he's accomplished so many things. It's like, well, why not stay at home and enjoy his palace and enjoy these things? And that is the ongoing temptation for man, isn't it? That it's like you put in the hard work. Now it's like, so now let me just kind of relax and coast.
Right.
But the warning is, if you relax and coast, you're going to go awry.
And isn't that the nature of Israel as a nation too, right? So when God finally brings them into the promised land and gives them victory, then their temptation in wandering in the wilderness, their sins are against the Lord himself, right? Doubting his goodness for them, doubting his provision for them. But when he brings them into the promised land, then it's complacency, then it's laziness, then it's allowing the Canaanites to survive. Then it's gradually allowing the Canaanite gods into their homes as well, intermarrying with them.
Yeah. I've never thought about that. That's a good picture of, there's always, you can maybe summarize and say there's two different types of chapters in your life that you'll go back and forth. And sometimes you're in the wilderness, sometimes there's suffering, and there's certain temptations when you're in the wilderness, and it's to doubt God's goodness, right? To only see with eyes of what you can observe. This hurts. That sucks. And like, that's all you can see. And therefore you doubt, God's presence.
Right.
And then there's the good time where you can kind of say with your lips all that you want because everything's good and comfortable, but then what's slipping in, but these false idols, and really, really, what is your life oriented towards? It's oriented towards these other things that are self-pleasing and kind of inwardly oriented. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. In the beginning, at least in the wilderness, at least your anger is directed towards God or towards his prophet.
Yeah.
Then that is a kind of exercise of faith in a sense.
Yeah.
Versus the sort of crass unbelief of, well, now we've arrived, now we have the kingdom, and now it's all on us to maintain the kingdom.
Yeah, what's the quote? There's no atheists in war camps.
Yeah,
or there's no atheists
in a foxhole.
In a foxhole. Yeah, very true. That's that's not a temptation when you get into the fires of life.
Yeah,
and in some ways, comfort is one of those chief issues, and our culture right now is oriented towards comfort.
Yeah,
which I think is one of those, to tie back into masculinity, that does kind of take the heart out of man to some degree.
Yeah,
I think all men are looking and seeking a battle, and you can seek incorrect battles. Your battle can be, to make $1 million more than last year, for the sake of, impressing others or something, or like the gentleman you were talking about, who's not a gentleman, but what was his name?
Andrew Tate.
Yeah, like him, like that would be a good example of a man that's, fighting battles, like, whatever.
Right.
But we are in search of battles, comfort kind of sucks that out of us. And our culture is so kind of focused on those comforts. And, maybe you can even think of the church service in that. I remember right before we got married, my wife's from Canada. So, we had dated, for the most part, long distance, visited each other and such, but she had to move a week before we got married. So she moved in, lived with my parents. And someone had given us tickets to like a Christian concert, which I never go to Christian music concerts. So this is my first and her first. And it was like hyper. I don't have anything against a Christian concert. Like if you want to play Christian music, that's fine. But this one was over the top. And we were sitting up top and we're looking down. There was these guys, and they looked so effeminate and like in this kind of emotiveness. And you were just looking at it, and it was like you could just sense it. That was not natural. Like that was not masculine. It was a very effeminate type way of attempting to experience spirituality or God. But I think that even the way that we've operated Christianity in an effeminate way, we've taken the heart out of men, which is why they become so disinterested with Christianity. And that's where someone like Jordan Peterson comes along. He's even teaching on the Bible. He's very interested in that. But he's bringing all the grit of the masculinity to the forefront, and men are attracted to that, which is why he sells out stadiums, why you've got empty churches. Men drive past the churches to go learn from him. But it's a good lesson of, for a long period of time, we've focused on that comfortability and, everything's going to be okay because God loves you. And those kind of like blanket feminine type statements. And that return to what you were talking about earlier, those things in orthodoxy, those things in kind of traditional Latin Mass Catholicism and, I'd say confessional Lutheranism as well, should get back to that and the calling to bear your cross and follow your Savior and all these kind of, challenging things that causes men to rise up and then better provide for their families.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, men, they have this drive. Every kid reading a comic book or, watching a superhero film wants to be the hero.
Yeah.
And we've, so, the narrative of Christianity is you don't need to be a hero. Christ has done everything for you, which is 100% true. But that's not the end of the story then.
Yeah.
We're not redeemed by Christ to sort of, just be given to this life of praise and adoration. So we're, we receive all the goodness of Christ, and that orients us back outward towards the world. And God will use men as, as heroes. Every boy's drive to be a superhero comes to fruition when God gives that man a child, right? I mean, here is someone who critically depends upon man to be good, to in repentance check his selfish nature and receive forgiveness, so that he might live oriented outwards towards the good of this child. And the church of all places needs to be saying, and Jordan Peterson has said this: the church needs to say to young men, your masculinity is welcomed here, right? And we should say exactly that. Your masculinity, your drive to be useful to the people around you, to be desired for what you contribute, is welcome here, right? And we will show you and we will teach you why God has printed these desires into your heart. And the godly fulfillment for those drives is that he would give you a wife and children, and he would make you a culture builder. He would, through the church, enable you to build a home, to build neighborhoods, to build cities, to build states. All that drive can be best fulfilled when man has his identity secure in Christ. And then it's not just one directional either, right? So man isn't just oriented outward towards the good of these people, because we live with this reality being at the same time justified and sinful. So man then will turn around, and he'll come back Sunday morning. He'll be leading his family back to the altar, and he'll be the first one teaching by example what it means to confess our sins and receive forgiveness. And then all together they'll turn around and they'll go back out into the world, confessing Christ in their vocations, making good and beautiful things, writing hymns and poetry, and crafting, taking the elements of creation and making them into things beautiful and good, for the good of the world around them. This man is made for this, and all of those drives find their fulfillment in the church.
I'm going to tease an idea out with you, because as you're speaking, kind of had this idea, and it could be wrong, right? So we can feel free to push back on it. But there's almost an aspect of, so we know herein is the heart of God, right? Herein is love, that a man gives up his life, for his brother. Okay, so what is at the very heart? So you're kind of looking up and you're saying, okay, so who is God, right? And God is revealing himself. And when you get to the core of the matter, God is other oriented, right? And you get that with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like,
right.
The Father's been glorifying me from, the beginning of, time. I've been glorifying the Father. The Holy Spirit's been glorifying. So there's this other orientedness within the Trinity.
Yeah.
That pours out into creation. So creation is kind of an outpouring. And then there's kind of this mystery of God being played out. And then you get to the heart, which is the crucifixion. It's like, okay, so the heart of God is sacrificial and other oriented. Okay. So then you kind of plug us in. And there's kind of two aspects, and maybe the most obvious one is we are now receptive of that, right? So that love now pours into us, right? So, and that is an aspect where, like, you're there, Christ is going to give us his blessings. The service is God serving us. He's going to give us the body and blood and such. But there's also with that an invitation into the heart of what is good, true, and beautiful when Jesus says, "Pick up your cross and follow me." Right? In that picking up your cross and following it's not just like I don't know if it's just a result of sin necessarily, or a punishment or anything like that, but it's actually you're doing exactly what Jesus has done.
Yeah.
So back to that, like, the desire of God is for man to live fully, for him to live the life that he was supposed to live. And in order to do that, you actually have to pick up your cross and follow Jesus. Pick up your cross and serve those around you. And your life will consist to the degree in which you do that, right? But that aspect is maybe the aspect that gets lost. The first one is a little bit more easy to articulate.
Yeah.
Where we say, God loves you, and here's how he's done that. And that's, of course, that's a staple and a bedrock of what we believe. But there's this other aspect to, so now that Christian life is pick up your cross, not as a punishment, but actually enter into this other orientedness and sacrificial nature. And that's where you'll kind of experience in temporal time the very purpose of what your life was given to you for.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thoughts on that. You can push back on it too.
No, I think that's exactly right. And a lot of what we've been trying to articulate about masculinity, and there's a certainty to it. Think about the way in which we've often wrongly thought about evangelism. Which is right. So we understand that I'm saved only by God's work alone. But then, sometimes we're told if you don't do something, people will go to hell.
Yeah.
Right.
That snapping every time you snap a finger.
It will stop snapping your fingers.
Yeah.
Why is salvation purely God's work when it comes to me, but it requires my cooperation to save someone else, right? Well, which is just false, right? Article 4, justification, and Article 11 on election go hand in hand. God will save all of his elect, full stop. Christ has done everything to forgive all the sins of all the sinners, and not one of his elect will be lost in eternity. So there's a certain freedom then. We don't, if I fail to tell anyone about Jesus, God will still save all of his elect. but I will miss out on the pleasure of being the instrument by which God reveals his mercy to someone else, right? So if I refuse to bring my children to the waters of baptism, God will still save all of his elect. But I will miss out on the joy of being the means by which God does that. Well, the same is true for our vocation as well, in a sense. In the end, right, God's good creation will be restored on the day of Jesus' return. Nothing can undo the resurrection. But until then, I am given the joy and the privilege of building a world towards the resurrection. Now, not in like a post-millennial kind of way, not in like we need to build the kingdom of Christ here so that Jesus can finally return, but rather my identity and my future are secure in Christ, and I know on the last day all the dead will rise. So everything in between those two goalposts is just, the details that we get to play around with and have fun with. It's then, if I know that, in a sense, I can't mess up teaching the Bible and the catechism and the hymnal to my children, then it just makes that task more pleasurable, more fun. It imbues it with a sense of playfulness that in the end I can't mess it up. All of God's elect will be saved. On the last day, he will raise me and all the dead and give eternal life to me and all believers in Christ. And until then, I just get to play around in his creation with the callings that he's given me and serve the people he's given me to serve, knowing that, my sinful flesh is never powerful enough to undo his crucifixion and resurrection.
That's really good. Tell me, I'm going to tease something else out, just kind of building off that. It seems like one of the chief problems is like self-assertion, right? So in other words, I'm going to do something that is kind of not crafting, but like I'm choosing to do it. It's not commanded me by the Father.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So with Jesus as the prime example, and Adam, right? So what does Adam do? But he kind of asserts his own will up against the Father. Like here's Adam standing outside of what the Father has created him to do. And when you look at Jesus, you've got, that was certainly in John, right? So you've got the imagery of the Word, which we could unpack that, but then you get to like the temptation. One of the things with the temptation is Jesus does do some of those things. Like he does multiply bread later on and stuff like that. But what's the temptation in the wilderness? It's to do it for the Father hasn't told him to do those things. Yeah. Right. And he's doing it just for himself versus when he multiplies bread later, he's feeding the 5,000, when he goes up on the temple and when he goes up on the cross, he's doing it, for the others, he is going to become the king of all the world, but he's going to do it on the Father's time. Right. So there's that aspect of the devil tempting him to do things for himself, but also for Jesus to kind of assert himself above the Father. Yeah. And say, now I'm going to do this rather than the Father. And you can see that play out later, particularly in like John 5 or 17, where, it's like, can we see the Father? And Jesus is like, but you are seeing the Father. Yeah. Because I am the icon. Like all that I'm doing is exactly what the Father would have me do. And then in John 17, he reflects on that unity. All that I've done is what the Father has asked me to do. And excuse me. Then he prays that the disciples would do exactly what Jesus has done. So there's this aspect that when someone sees Paul, and Paul even speaks this way, right? So when you see Paul, you're really seeing Jesus, but you're seeing the Father, right? The Father is flowing properly because Paul's aligned to Jesus' words and Jesus is aligned to the word of the Father. Yeah. And then, he prays for, Jeff Hemmer, living in the future, that Jeff would be aligned with Paul. He would be aligned with Jesus, and then the Father kind of flows through. So there's this aspect of, to your point, okay, if the salvation of people around me is necessarily on my self-assertion, that is, it's an inverse of that. It creates all the tangible results of like, now I go to bed anxiety ridden because did I say a dumb thing on this podcast? That's, leads someone astray. No, how is it that the Father's salvific work goes? It goes through kind of the transparency of everyone that's involved. That when you're speaking, the Father's speaking through you.
Yeah.
Through the Son, and that's just the way it works. But there's this invisibility of yourself, which is the inverse of pride, because pride is looking at yourself, looking in the mirror, and kind of the inverse is for your eyes to be like wrenched out of yourself and just to be geared towards the Father. And then the Father works through the Holy Spirit to speak through you. Does that, that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, that an excellent point on pride there too. Like what drives pride except fear, right? What if I'm really nothing? And so I've got to make a name for myself. I've got to, curry the respect and the favor of other people. It like when the men built the Tower of Babel, they were afraid of being dispersed across the face of the earth. So let's build a tower that will establish a name for ourselves. Well, pride is so very fear driven. But if my identity is given to me from outside of myself, then not only do I have no cause for pride if it's all given to me by another, but I also don't need pride, because I'm not afraid that I'm nothing, because I am what the Father in Jesus has declared me to be, and so when I serve my neighbor, when I love my wife, when I catechize my children, when I love my neighbor, I don't have to make a name for myself. I don't have to worry about, in the end, will they know me, and respect me or love me, and so there's a freedom in that humility then as well, that everything I am is because God has declared me to be it. So then whatever I do for the good of those he's given me to serve, can just be for their benefit and not for the building up of my own name.
Have you seen the movie A Hidden Life?
No.
I just want to get the name right. So it's a Terrence Malick. Have you seen any of his movies?
The name's familiar.
There's like The Tree of Life. He does. Brad Pitt's in that one.
Yeah.
One sec here. Hidden Life. About. So he does that, and then he does A Hidden Life, which is, I'm not a very emotional person, but this one it's probably the most emotionally in a way with no tricks. Like, it's just, the story is so beautiful and so to the core of sacrifice that it's just it's unreal. It's one of the best movies. So it's about it's a true story about Franz Jägerstätter, who was an Austrian farmer who is, I won't give away the rest of it, but point being, maybe the title of it, it's about somebody who kind of rejects the Nazi commands, so he becomes kind of a conscientious objector, for his Christian values.
Yeah.
And it goes through kind of the struggle of him, the struggle of his wife, but the key of the title, A Hidden Life, is that this is somebody like you would not know of, like you wouldn't see statues of him in any places, but that there's these hidden lives of people doing, in accordance with their conscience, in accordance with what God has said. And it's somewhat Christian. It's not like a, Christian production or anything like that, but it's very good at putting the imagery out there. But it's that beautiful thing of, there's all these hidden lives of people doing what but there's no pride in it. Like, he wasn't doing it as a public figure. And nothing against that, but like, he was just doing it as a private figure, and no one knew about his suffering but him and his wife. And it goes through that, and it's just it's an absolutely beautiful picture.
Well, I mean, even the title reminds me of, St. Paul's exhortation, for you have died and your life is now hidden with Christ. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. So on the day of his return, Christians get credit for all their good works, with all their sin removed, all their false motives, all the things that, in our own eyes and in the eyes of our neighbors, corrupt our good works for the time being. And so all that is now hidden with Christ, and certain that it'll be revealed on the day of his return. So, there's no no need to be celebrated right now, um, knowing that all those good works are not lost in eternity.
Let's switch gears slightly. I'm interested to hear about kind of how you now take these principles and you've applied it into your own household. If you can kind of walk through that, there's probably different aspects with your family, with your marriage, with kind of your own self-discipline.
Well, it's always easier to speak about it in theory than to examine my own life and say, do as I do. So we were talking earlier about children, and we were just blessed 2 weeks ago with the birth of our 9th child, and that's really, why have children? Why, what the atheist would say, why bring children into such a world of suffering? But Jesus exhorts us, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, who on the last day will receive you into your eternal dwelling. Well, that's what my children are. Friends for eternity, brothers and sisters in Christ in the resurrection. So it imbues my daily vocation with a new sense of meaning and purpose, right? So I think it was during the break we were talking about how so many of the things that we have to do on a daily basis can feel so mundane, and like at the end of the day we have not accomplished anything. Like, we've joked. My wife gives various names to the pile of laundry that is awaiting folding and being put away, that grows ever larger with the number of children that we have. So one of my favorites was Mount Medora Laundry, from like American Ninja Warrior. They conquer Mount Medora Yama. Anyway, it's unconquerable. The task is Sisyphean. We'll never get all the socks paired. But in the resurrection, we'll look back, and it will have been a tremendous privilege to have gotten to put socks on other human beings whom God has created and baptized, and whom he intends to rise with Christ in the resurrection. Then what will compare to that honor, right? Of having been able to provide clothing and food and shelter for these people who will rise in the resurrection. And there's a certain freedom to knowing I just can't mess up as a father. But also, so for instance, we're trying to get into a better family discipline of devotions. Which becomes, on the one hand, it becomes more difficult the more children we have, right? There's always someone who needs something at the time that we've set aside for devotions, right? Somebody needs to go to the bathroom, or I don't know, someone's working on homework, or someone's not home from a basketball game or something. But on the other hand, with more of us, right, with 11 of us intended to gather for family devotions at the end of the day, there are more people who can help us stay on task. So I've incentivized my children, if we do these for 10 days in a row with no disruptions, maybe everyone's not present, maybe someone's got something going on and grandma's going to bring him home later. But if we just do this for 10 days or for 30 days in a row with no break, then we can all get cookies or something. So there, right, the lesser thing, the motivation to get a cookie, provides us all with the greater thing of, with 9 people all trying to remember we've got to do devotions, we're much more likely to get it done. So
there's
on the one hand,
good discussion out of that.
Also true. The chaos intensifies with 9 children. but also there's a better sense of order and discipline. There are more hands for the work. There are more minds for the task. There are much more work, but more people as well. And so even the task of having little children at home is lightened with older children who can help out in that task, right? So to get out the door to go to school, we've got to make 7 lunches, but now there's other people who can help towards that end.
Yeah.
So the same things that feel more tedious in some ways are more lightened in others. And then, we were talking about,
I'm interested in kind of the farm too, or the aspirations there.
Yeah.
And what some of the goals are there for, bringing children in, to like giving them good things to do, having them aspire towards, godly living later in life.
Right. Well, the goal is good food that is the product of our own labor, that we can say, that we collaborated on this. We're all, fighting against the thorns and thistles, the weeds that would infect creation, that are the result of sin. And we're all fighting together against those to produce, here's a cucumber, or here's a chicken. And the food then both nourishes us before it's consumed, right? Because there's the nourishment of everyone laboring towards a common endeavor, and then there's the enjoyment and the nourishment that comes when that endeavor is actually nourishing to the body.
That's got to be enjoyable. We were talking about this last night with Ben, but I've never hunted.
Yeah.
We'll buy a quarter cow, but I've never raised anything. Well, we've done a little garden, so I've plucked a cucumber and eaten it. But there's got to be something very rewarding about, here's the meal, and we've done all of the work as a family. We've all put in different hands, different contributions, and here's that labor. It's got to be an enjoyable meal.
It is, yeah, and right. It's not just the producing of the food. Then the raw materials have to be transformed into a meal, right? And again, this requires the cooperation of all the people in the household. Maybe not everybody contributes the same amount of work or does the same tasks, right? There's a complementarity to it as well. And the end product then is that we're all brought together. There's a kind of egalitarian enjoyment of the meal in the end. So it takes everyone's buy-in, everyone's work to bring this to fruition. But when we get there, then everyone is nourished and fed.
Is it as expensive as some people might fear to have 9 kids?
Probably.
So
so we've only done things on a small scale before now. So we've raised some chickens for eggs, and we've raised some broiler chickens for meat, and we've done some hogs. And it's easy to let expenses far outpace the actual benefit in the end.
Yeah.
The goal is to manage all that and to utilize the pastures that we have as much as possible. To use the grass that grows, to harvest the sunlight in a sense, and use grass as much as possible as feed. But there's going to be inevitable looming expenses like fencing and infrastructure that wears out, and doing those things on a smaller family size scale means those expenses are a little more acute at times, I suspect.
Yeah.
But we're just at the cusp of that for now.
Yeah, well, I hope it goes well. And you're thinking pigs, you're thinking cows, you're thinking
and we'll have some. So I don't know how much you follow. Like we, I listened to the book. I was first introduced to Joel Salatin. He's a farmer out in Virginia. He's kind of a rock star in the
like
agrarian community. He was featured in Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and we listened to that driving together somewhere. It's just my wife and me, I think. then heard he wrote a book, You Can Farm. And it like having a garden is the gateway drug. You have a garden, and then you get some chickens, and then then you get some bees, and then you have livestock. And so that for us was what sort of set our minds in motion. And that was, I don't know, 15 or so years ago, thinking this might be where we'd like to be as a family.
So it's been a long time in motion that you guys have been working towards this.
Salatin's model is you've got rotational kind of grazing. So you have your livestock come through first, and they eat the grass down, and then you have the poultry come through, and they can scratch through the manure and eat the fly larvae out and spread the manure around so that it doesn't just burn up one part of the pasture. So ideally, if everything is working together cooperatively, you can keep expenses down.
So you wouldn't have to buy like fertilizer and things like that.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And then at the end of the day, you eat your lawnmowers.
Yeah. And then would you plant the garden then in that spot then too after that's taken place?
No, or that would just be the grass for pasture. Okay. So eventually, once that land has come back, the grass has grown back, then you rotate your hooved animals through it, your grazers through, and then you bring your chickens through a couple days after that.
Yeah. Any final thoughts you want our listeners to know?
This has been fun. And there's so much we've said, so much more we could say, but really, I think what we were just talking about a few minutes ago about the freedom that should be ours because of our identity in Christ, whether it's freedom for men or freedom for women, freedom for boys wanting to feel like men. God in Christ has called us to be everything good, everything necessary. And so the rest of our Christian life then is just pure freedom. It normed and hedged in by the law, shaped by the identity that he calls us in baptism. But that really should give to every young man the sense of fulfillment that he's after, that he's seeking in life. It can only be found in Christ, in his church, and the playfulness and the freedom to live in that goodness as a godly man for the good of others, that will only be attained in Christ and in his church.
Jeff, thank you very much.
This absolutely a pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
Next time we'll bring you out to Minnesota.
Sounds good.
It's nice and warm up there.
Yeah, well, you brought the Minnesota weather with you.
Yeah, we did. All right, cheers.
Yeah.